You, because I'm sure this is going to be a really exciting discussion. So if it's okay, we'll just go ahead and jump in. And apologies everybody as well for missing Monday. I was even in worse shape then. So I promise you didn't miss anything for me, but I was able to listen in. Bernie, of course, did a fantastic job. Great discussion. Really, really enjoyed it. And I look forward to chatting with you in person, Joe, and shortly. Maybe not exactly today, unless we mask up, but shortly. So anyway, today we are really, really excited to follow up. Oh, actually, before I introduce Krisztina, we'll get going. One other thing. This is just for fun, guys. But on Friday, during the lunch hour, we're going to try something kind of unique. We're calling it Jamming with Jimmy. So this is going to be a chance for any of you who are musically inclined or would like to become inclined. I'm more in the latter category myself. I used to play trumpet back in the day. But we're going to try to do a quick, just kind of fun string instrument, mostly guitar lesson. There's going to be some ukuleles. Jimmy Walker, of course, one of our former directors is going to come over, lead the group. We'll learn a few chords. There's going to be some pizza. It's going to be very relaxing. Stop in if you'd like to. If you have an instrument, bring it. If not, like I said, I'm going to try to bring some extras. You might be stuck with the pink ukulele from one of my daughters, so be warned. But would love to see you if you're around on Friday at noon, and it'll be a good time. Just an experiment, just a chance for us, just kind of relax, socialize, have some fun. Maybe we can find Lynn's old tambourine as well. So okay, so that's going to be a Friday at noon, and we'll send out something about that too. Okay. But without further ado, then, Krisztina, I'm so excited to focus on your work entitled Under Pressure, Organizational Responses in the Changing Civic Space of Hungary. Loved it. Can't wait to hear your comments. And then, of course, per usual, guys, we'll have a moderated discussion after that. So feel free, raise hands. For those in the Ostrom room in particular, as you guys know, the cameras sometimes work better than others. So if I'm not seeing you and you'd like to interject, either just speak, of course, right? That's always easy, or just let me know with the chat box, and we'll take it from there. So without further ado, Krisztina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to share the screen. So let me know if you can see it. And I'm sorry I will miss the Friday session. I could bring the Hungarian zither. I know you'll miss it. But it's not very different from the American dulcimer. So anyways, so this is a paper that I just recently submitted, and I will see what's going to happen to it. I suppose it's part of my dissertation, but it's only about the sample is just one part that is going to form the dissertation. So in this paper, I'm focusing on service providing organizations in Hungary. So just a few words about what is this shrinking space. So shrinking or closing space in the literature is usually refers to legal and non-legal measures restricting civil society. It is a global and growing phenomenon. So by now, actually over 90 countries restrict civil action or the work of civil society organizations in some form or another. Most often it's restrictions on foreign funding, but the measures really can take any form, even physical harassment. It's mostly happening in hybrid regimes, which are somewhere between democracy and authoritarian regimes. Of course, authoritarian regimes are in the pool as well. It's even more alarming that mostly established democracies joined these measures as well, such as Austria, Spain, India, and so on. And there's a recent conversation whether we should talk about shifting space rather than shrinking space, because even in hybrid and authoritarian regimes, what's happening that the government is differentiating between advocacy and service providing NGOs, and they do engage service providing NGOs in their work. They provide funding for them. They maybe even consult with them. And they also provide generous funding for government organized nonprofits. So they are basically reshaping the civic space. So maybe the space is actually not shrinking, just shifting or changing in a way. So in this paper, I focus on these three questions. So first, I analyze how different layers and levels of government actors exert pressure on organizations or how they mitigate it. So I'm focusing on organizational response, specifically in an environment where formal restrictions are much more important than informal ones. And I look at two factors out of this framework that I will show you in the next slide. So of Oliver's framework, I'm focusing on just two factors here. One is the role of constituents, dependence and multiplicity of constituents, and the nature of the pressure. So why Hungary and my research is interesting for this literature is that by now this is kind of an established literature. So we know a lot about why governments restrict the space, how they do it, how they justify it, and so on, how organizations respond to it. However, very few studies have looked at the fragmented nature of government and the effect on it, on this phenomenon. And most cases in most countries work with formal restrictions that are strictly enforced. Hungary is different, that in the sense that we have formal restrictions or measures, but they are not enforced actually at all. Yet informal pressure is high. So the question comes then, what happens in such an environment? And the third reason is that this paper is submitted to a special issue that focuses on service providing organizations, because the literature predominantly analyzes advocacy organizations, since they are the ones that are mostly attacked by governments. That doesn't mean that service providing organizations are not affecting though. And there's a recent recognition that they contribute to democratization as well. So the theoretical framework that I am using is coming from Krisztina Oliver, who wrote this seminal paper in 1991, where she combined institutional theory and resource dependence. So she created a framework and a ton of hypotheses on how organizations would respond to environmental pressure based on these two theories. She came up with 5 strategic responses that organizations could choose. These range from passive acquiescence to active manipulation. And she listed 5 factors that she believes predict the nature, the type of response. So the first one is cause. So why is the organization pressured? The second, constituent, who is pressuring the organization? The third one is content, which refers to what is the pressure in place or the restriction. Control refers to whether it's legally enforced or it's supposed to spread just with voluntary diffusion. The fifth one is context, so whether the environment is an interconnected environment or just a loose one. So in this paper, I'm focusing on 2 factors. The first one is constituents. With nonprofits, kind of comes naturally that since the government is the pressurer, we just cannot take this out of the equation. So how dependence on the government changes response, and how the presence of other constituents influences it. And control is important in the case of Hungary. As I said, we do have formal or legal measures, but the higher pressure is coming into informal channels. So I had a few expectations based on Oliver and based on nonprofit literature. So regarding control, it's easy. The lower the degree of pressure, the greater the likelihood of organizational resistance. What is different in Hungary, that the level of that we have 2 types of pressure, formal and informal pressure, and the level of these 2 actually can differ for the same organization. So one organization can have very low formal pressure because, let's say, they don't have the amount that would force them to register as a foreign funded organization, which is one of the restrictions or one of the stigmas. Yet they may receive a ton of informal pressure. For example, they are regularly attacked in the media, or public agencies don't want to work with them. Regarding constituent multiplicity, so Oliver says that organizations that have more constituents are more likely to resist because they have different expectations and they cannot fulfill them all. So they will try to resist in some form at least. I said that in the nonprofit world, it's a little bit different, as constituent multiplicity matters not only for that, but also for funding. So I say that organizations that are not so dependent on the state, either because they have other funders or because their programs don't need the state's approval, can afford resisting. And I also said that more resistance strategies in organizations, that organizations that have multiple constituents, yes, can resist as long as other funders or other supporters are present. Sorry, for a second, I wasn't seeing my slides. So this is just a chart to show you the different type of constituents a nonprofit can have. Many have more, many have fewer. So national government, local mayor, some even engage with the EU, school board, for example, if they work with schools, or the police and so on, foreign funder. So how does the shrinking civic space look like in Hungary? What does it mean? So it's shrinking since 2010. Since 2010, we have the same government, actually. It's the Fidesz party. So civil rights are restricted to some extent. The media is mostly owned by the government. There are independent platforms, though. Academic freedom is restricted, and so on. What is interesting, as I said, formal restrictions on civil society are usually not enforced. So as one of my informants said, they are basically communication panels and used as communication panels. So for instance, we have a law that requires, or we had one that required organizations that receive foreign funding to register and use basically a stamp on every communication material that they have, that they are funded, that they are foreign funded, and this was a stigma, wanted to say that they are not reliable and so on. Yet this was withdrawn in 2021 after the EU court forced Hungary to withdraw it. But even until that, the organizations that didn't register received actually no fine in the end. And there's another law that taxes the organizations who support immigrants, yet this isn't enforced either. And we have laws specifically more recently that are stigmatizing LGBTQ people and activities related to them. Those are more enforced. So the methodology here, this is a qualitative study, semi-structured interviews. This paper uses 19 interviews with leaders of 11 organizations. They all come from these three fields that are politically sensitive: the LGBTQ field, immigration or organizations supporting immigrants, and drug users. This was a purposeful sample. Organizations differed in size, type of funding, and ideology. By which I mean some are religious, some are in line with the government, some are not at all. So this is just to show you 4 organizations from immigration, 3 from LGBTQ, and 4 from drug addiction. So these are the findings. I'm not sure this is the best way to showcase them, but I couldn't so far come up with a better idea. So I'm looking forward to your suggestions as well. What I wanted to point out here, first of all, organizations do not only engage in one type of strategy. The theory said that they would either acquiesce or compromise or avoid whatsoever. What I find that most organizations actually do resist to some extent, but most of them do so that they acquiesce. At the same time, for instance, they register as a foreign funded organizations and use the label, but at the same time, they publicly protest against it. One of the organizations, actually, 2 of the organizations even filed claims at the Hungarian court, and one even went further to the EU level. So regarding dependence, what I find that most organizations fit the hypothesis that the more dependent they are on the government, the less they resist. Actually, the ones, 4 of them didn't resist at all. 3 of them had no reason to do so because They are religious organizations, favored partners of the government. And the fourth organization is highly dependent on the government, as they work with drug users but have absolutely no other source. So they couldn't afford resisting at all. The organizations, however, that resisted most here, B, E, F, G. B is a small grassroots organizations that work with immigrants. So they are actually flexible to the extent that they changed even the legal status in the recent years 3 times, just to respond to the changing opportunities and needs. And the other 3 organizations, E, F, G, are all coming from the LGBTQ field. They are also mostly run by volunteers. Even their activities don't need government approval. Some work in schools, do education in schools that needs approval, but if they need to, they can let those programs go and just focus on other activities. What is most interesting, at least to me, because it's different from theoretical exploitations from the nonprofit literature, that all the LGBT organizations started as service providing organizations, and in the last 10 years, they became advocacy organizations just as much. They still provide services, but advocacy became just as important. They told me that first, when the environment becomes hostile, you turn towards service because that's safer. But then as you attack more and more, you basically have to step up. You're forced to step up. Even the media asks for your opinion. So they felt that they have no choice. And what is important as well is that not only they are not dependent on the government, but we will see on the next slide that they all have foreign funding that is available to them. So I'd say that's a key characteristic of organizations that could afford the strongest forms of resistance, that they could attract foreign funding. There are 3 exceptions here that are dependent on the government, or not dependent on the government, sorry, but they didn't, sorry, for a second, so 3 exceptions that are dependent on the government, yet they resisted organizations K, I, and A. The most interesting is organization A. This is an organization that works with immigrants. Their funding came from the EU, but it was co-funded by the states, and they needed states' approval just to run their programs. They work with schools, police, and transit zones where the state holds immigrants waiting on their asylum. Yet they sued the government even at the EU level. So basically risked everything. Yet maybe the explanation is that 1 month later, also the UN, the United Nations, stepped in with funding so they could survive. Yet I still feel it's a very strong form of resistance. Regarding multiplicity of constituents, it's yes, yet even less clear-cut here. So more or less, the data fits the expectations that organizations that have a greater degree of constituent multiplicity resisted more. Yet there are organizations that have had few constituents, yet they resisted. These are the organizations B, G, and I. So in the case of B, as I said earlier, that they are fully volunteer run. So even though they depend on they don't have a lot of constituents, they do not depend on the government, so they could afford resisting. And it was the same with the organization G, who's a trans organization. They basically benefited from the hostility in the sense they told me that they had so few funding opportunities before that if the Hungarian state wouldn't be so hostile against them, probably they wouldn't exist anymore, because this hostility opened a lot of international opportunities for them for funding. So maybe they are even expected to resist in some sense. The organization E directed much of its resistance to the local government, as they had a conflict with the local government on their needle exchange program. So before closing, I just wanted to say a few words on the fragmented nature of government. Many organizations actually had very different relations dependent on the level. So some had a direct conflict with the government, and the local mayor helped alleviate this in some ways. In some cases, actually, it was the other way around. And the EU is most beneficial when it provides direct funding. So it works as a platform for legal remedy, yet the effectiveness is not, it's questionable. So as I said, some of the organizations sued the government at the EU level, so it withdraws the Lex NGO, and it happened eventually, yet the very next day the government came up with another law for the very same reason. So as long as the EU doesn't connect financial fines next to these legal remedies, it's not as effective. Yes, yet it symbolically is important, but it's most important when it provides direct funding for organizations. And the other important finding is that organizations, as I said, don't just engage in one type of strategy. They showcase more type of strategies, and most of them, even though they are service organizations and based on the literature, you wouldn't expect them to resist. They did resist even beyond their specific areas. So not just regarding immigration, drug policy, and so on, but most of them resisted regarding Lex NGO and the laws that affect civil society in general. And I would say that the most important finding is that organizations that are less dependent on the government actually turn to advocacy. This is a pattern that is very different from what we see in the literature. Usually what happens in the shrinking space that organizations turn towards a safer path of service provision. What we see in the LGBTQ organizations in Hungary, that all of them actually engage in advocacy more and more as the environment is becoming more and more hostile. So this is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hear your comments.
Thank you so much, Krisztina. Well, first off, round of applause. Wonderful, wonderful work. And, you know, it's a challenging time to do field work. I mean, especially now, my goodness. So well done. This is exciting. Maybe if you wouldn't mind, perhaps we could stop sharing your screen, and then it might just be a little bit easier to see everybody else on the line and then in the Ostrom room as well. And help me folks in the Ostrom room too, to make sure we don't miss anybody in terms of comments and questions. Okay. But yeah, Mike, if you're willing, let's start with you. Okay. And then we'll go down the link from there, and feel free, raise hands, use chat, etc. Over to you.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Krisztina, for an interesting paper. I don't know much at all about the NGOs in Hungary, and this was an interesting paper. First stab at this. I was pleased you mentioned, or it was useful that you mentioned this as part of your dissertation. I think you might mention that in the next version of the paper, saying that this is not the only thing you're studying about nonprofits. I haven't studied nonprofits directly, except for some humanitarian aid organizations. But one of the things I've drawn from that literature is that these NGOs are very complex entities. And I don't think you've really captured that complexity in terms of there's multiple things going on. You've picked service delivery organizations, and yet your dependent variable tends to be focused more in terms of their political activity, whether they go along with the political organization, political restrictions, whether they sign the forms, fill out the forms, you know, whether they limit their funding or report their fundings and things like that. What you don't have in there is a way in which I think a lot of the nonprofits might respond, is change the kind of services they deliver, sort of move the, or you know, sort of shift into if they're getting government resistance to what they're doing, they may move in a little different area and try to play a little lower key sort of area and try to deliver to their services, to the customers of the recipients of their benefits. And I think that one of the things that's missing here is what these organizations actually do in terms of service delivery. Now that may well be covered in other parts of your dissertation, but it seems very missing in this paper, especially since you picked these organizations because they were service delivery, and yet their services isn't really part of your analysis. I would expect, for example, to see some variation in the types of services that these organizations provide. It's not just where they get their funding, it's what they do. And some things they can do, only with direct government interaction, and some things they can do sort of on the sly, underhandedly, or they can become very dependent on UN and Western European support, and kind of, like you mentioned, benefit from not working with the government and things like that. So, but it's not just funding. I think one of the thing that troubled me kind of the most with this analysis, again, this is very tough to get your handle on these organizations, and you've picked up a lot of information about these organizations. And as Scott said, field research is not so easy these days. But I think you've defined the constituents a little too narrowly, or the constituency multiplicity a little narrowly, as being where they get their funding. And nonprofits require more than just money. They require volunteers. They require people with enthusiasm for that project. And again, that's going to vary by service type. If they're, working towards helping provide clean water, that doesn't excite a lot of donors compared to other things that might, providing humanitarian aid, helping refugees, or something like that. There's sort of a variation in the nature of the services that they're going to be providing. So, and I would say that the recipients of the policies are constituents too. If they're providing services and no one wants the services, then they're not going to prosper. There's not going to continue any continued sort of effort. So I'd encourage you to expand the definition of constituency, or the constituents, to be stakeholders, if you will. I would sort of think of it more as stakeholders, beyond just the people who are, cutting the checks for them, or giving them funding. Because I think kind of the problem with your analysis is that your two independent variables aren't that different. If constituent multiplicity is just the same as dependence on government funding, then that's really only one variable. And you don't have variables on what they're doing, or how they're varying in their type of organization. You mentioned in your discussion here that some of these organizations were driven or religious based, and so you sort of had that as the ideology. There's nothing in your analysis about that, the way you've written it up here. I was just doing a quick search through it, and apparently the J organization has a religious organization. That's the only one you really talk about in there. But in this literature, whether it's a religious organization or not is often a big deal, and that strikes me as something that should be one of your potential independent variables of explaining the kind of response they're making to the governments, and also the kind of services they're providing. Again, I think this is a very useful, good start, but I think you've defined your question a little too narrowly, and some of your terms a little too narrowly, to really capture the fascinating complexity of these non-government organizations. So I'll stop piling on right now and give you a chance to respond and let other people ask some questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree with you, actually. No, it's so the thing is that I'm in the middle of data collection and analyzing data. This paper was written up very fast for a special issue.
Been there, done that.
Yes.
Add a footnote. Add a couple footnotes that say, hey, look, you know, I see this, that's paper number 4. I
Yeah.
see that, this is paper number 5. Yeah, you'll.
And this is not going to be a 3-paper dissertation.
Doesn't matter.
This is going to be a manuscript. So this is just one very narrow
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah,
But it's still useful to put it in the context of the
Yeah.
broader dissertation.
Yeah.
Even if it's being reviewed for publication somewhere else, they're going to want to know this is not the only thing you're studying.
Yep.
They're going to want to know this paper is to focus on this aspect of the problem. And that also gives you an excuse to tell the reader a little more about the rest of your research and what else you're doing, and see that sort of helps contextualize this piece of research. But these are the kinds of things you'll pick up on sort of as you're going through this process. So.
Okay.
But do think about expanding and clarifying. I think the constituency is the one that I really had trouble sort of figuring out why that's the way you looked at it. Again, I tend to think in terms of stakeholders, and I would include as the stakeholders the people who are benefiting from it. And then that immediately leads to what are they benefiting? How are they benefiting? What are their services sort of providing? So I bet you've got a lot of information in your interviews about how these organizations changed the way they delivered services, how they found people that need these services, how they would get around government restrictions or do some things, you know, underground kind of, so that it's not seen very well, and then other times go out. So I think there's a lot more in your case studies. I mean, in your interviews. My guess. It sounds like they were very substantial interviews with a broad group, but you know, it's a good start.
I think the main problem is that because I needed the theoretical framework and I used this from Oliver's, these 2 factors, I just written everything up based on those 2 factors, even though you are totally right that even those 2 factors are not fully worked out in terms of constituencies.
Yeah, well, let me follow up on that real quickly, because one of the reasons I immediately saw the concern about the services is the emphasis in the workshop perspective on the nature of the good. And that's just one of the things that have been trained after seeing all this stuff for 30 years or so, to think of the nature of the good as an important factor. You know, it's not just the funding, it's not just who's provide what the legal contexts are, but it's the problem they're dealing with. And you've got 3 very distinct kinds of problems here with groups that have benefited groups that have some stigma attached to them in that particular context. And that plays an important role in how the government provides things in there too. So, you know, so it's usually good advice to follow the money, but that's not the only thing going on in these cases. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Mike. It's fantastic. And as you guys saw in the chat there, I think Jamie's next, and then we'll take it from there.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Krisztina, for a really cool paper. You know, at the beginning of the Ostrom class in the fall semester, I'm trying to remember, was it Mike or Aurelian? It was the day that you guys were pinch hitting for Dan. And you mentioned how nonprofit work from an Ostrom perspective is this field that's just wide open. So your paper really can speak to this. And I know Paul Alajica has written a paper on nonprofits that I found really helpful as well, in which he talks about the idea of stakeholders, you know, that Mike referred to as co-producers. And so that also ties in really neatly with the idea of the types of goods that are involved. So Mike, I just want to say as an aside, Mike has a really great way of getting us to agree with his perspective. I know I've certainly changed my scholarship based on his feedback. So thank you for being here. Also, but I did have a question, because you mentioned at the end of your presentation and on page 19 of your paper, you mentioned like the influence of the EU as this extra layer of legal, adding this extra layer of like legal requirements, so to speak, through fines. That would be really interesting, I think, to tease out a little bit more. It actually might help contextualize your work even more. I'm familiar with that in the sense of looking at like music and European politics through music, but the observations have been made that, for instance, like that the EU, because of having friendly policies towards LGBTQ people, would not, for instance, allow people into countries into the EU that don't have those kinds of policies. And so since that is an aspect of the nonprofits that you're looking at, you might want to look at that kind of tension between, you know, the supranational and the national levels of discourse on these very tense social issues. Because I suspect that's coming into play more than your paper has described. And maybe that's like footnote for paper number 8. Not sure, but yeah, that's something that I see.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, and you know, for what it's worth, Jamie, I also caught that last section, you know, with interest, and I'll just put this in the chat as well, Krisztina. Like we'd mentioned with, you know, Angie and Mike a minute ago, so many papers here, right? But I think you could absolutely build out, you know, if you're interested, kind of the polycentric angle here a little bit. That's a link to an edited volume about polycentricity in the EU, focusing, and there's a couple of chapters there focusing on civil society groups. And you know, it's pretty timely, you know, frankly, given the war in Ukraine and maybe kind of a retrenchment, even in Eastern Europe, maybe even in Hungary. I mean, time will tell of some more respect for democratic norms, civil society, etc. So anyway, I just feel like that could be like a timely addition if you were interested in taking that bent. I'm sure all this has happened after you finish your field work, etc. I hope, but at least as a follow-up.
Thank you.
Yeah. Great, guys. Other comments, other questions? Jess, I think, please, yeah.
Yeah, mine is just maybe a suggestion for some literature, which is, so I think, as everybody has said, super timely work, but it makes me think a little bit of a former workshopper who's now at Berkeley, Yen Long. Her work is situated particularly in China and particularly around the space of health organizations and health activism. But her book, Side Effects, is really about this interplay between domestic community organizations, authoritarian governments, and transnational actors as well. But it really, speaks a little bit to Mike's point about whether this particular service or good or policy domain might matter in terms of shaping the responsiveness and the nature of the response by the organization. But she also does a really wonderful job of thinking about the extent to which this is potentially a bi-directional problem, right? That the community organizations or that the NGOs or the nonprofits that you're thinking about might respond to Orban and his policies of shrinking space, but they might find space in other areas and therefore push back on this shrinking of the space. And so I just wanted, so as I was sort of looking through your paper, it really sort of reminded me of her presentation at the workshop several years back now, thinking about kind of similar questions in a different policy domain and different regional space, but just might help you sort of think about Mike's question a little bit, as well as sort of like thinking of some interesting and different directions you might go for sort of understanding how these organizations are nimble or not, how they adapt, right? And then what the consequences might be for the regime as well.
What was the name? I didn't get it.
So I'll put it in the chat. Don't worry. I'll just put it in the chat.
We're obviously saving all this too, Krisztina, including the chat. So no worries if you miss anything. And thank you everybody in the Ostrom room. I'm sure there's probably multiple people with hands up. So whoever would like to go first, please. Sorry, I can't really tell from the camera angle. Joe,
Yes.
I think. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'm Joe. This is a very interesting paper and presentation because I'm looking also at the civic organization in my country, but I just didn't pick it well when she talked about the original space and the pressure involved. Because depending on the civic organization, the space varies. It is very fluid. I don't know whether you would be able to explain more about the original space. What is the ideal space from which the pressure is being endorsed, so that we can be able to discern that really there is pressure in place, because each civic organization has its own way of working. And then you indicated that these are determined by laws. And of course, laws are there to be observed. And you indicated some organizations become defiant. And when they become defiant, what happens in terms of enforcement? So I thought that was not clearly coming out in the presentation itself.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of define, nothing happens. That's what I wanted to say, that this is part of the reason why Hungary is interesting, that actually now we know that nothing happened to the organizations that resisted, that didn't register or didn't pay tax on organizations that support immigrants. I'm not sure I got the idea, your idea of the original space. No, I agree that the space is different from for every field, for immigrants, drug users, and so on, and even for type of organization, whether it's service or advocacy, or both. So by original space, you meant just general restrictions on civil society, or?
Yeah, what I meant is the space, the original space from which the pressure is being felt. Is each civic organization, what is the ideal space under which you start realizing the pressure?
Okay.
Organization. Because how do you know there is pressure, and how much pressure is being denied in these civic organizations?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, excellent comment, Joe. Thank you.
There's another question from our room.
Please.
Hi, so my name is Angelo. I'm actually I'm a recent admit into the SPIA program here, and I'm visiting the workshop. And I was brought in here. Where's the camera? There it is. I think it's there. Hi. Okay.
It's so
and
confusing.
so
Feel
my
free.
question, I have well, I guess more introduction too. So some context too is like, you know, my background was working with Seba Siddiqui in Syracuse University, who does like institutional grammar stuff. So one thing, you know, if there's a I don't know if this helps, this is a big rabbit hole to jump down, but like, if we're talking about pressure, especially amongst like LGBTQ, like folk, like, you know, something that I've been interested in, and something maybe I would pursue, you know, if I was to be able to go here to SPIA, right, is like, you know, how do norms evolve amongst like LGBTQ folk? So like amongst like in the grammar, right, we talk about a rule, you will have it or else, but like amongst us queer folk, right, like it's not like, you know, we have sanctions against like, you know, who can be like a trans person, who can be like a trans man, and all like the whole kind of like complex language that exists amongst like queer folk. And so like, just want to throw out there, like, you know, if you were in your interviews and you had the chance to partner with the folks at IGRI, I think it'd be interesting to see kind of how the norms are discussed amongst LGBTQ folk, because again, like they're really contested a ton. And I think that would probably like, you know, affect a lot of the way that people organize and whatnot. And then I just have a question. It's just in regards to Hungary, because again, I'd be curious to hear like, when you say there's hostility, right, amongst like queer folk within the country, I would love to hear more like what that means exactly, right? Because like, you know, I guess if we were to use the phrase like polycentricity, right, in the sense of like, you know, I'm from the Philippines, and like the queer kind of advocacy movements that's happening in the Philippines, you know, it's very dispersed and very disconnected, right? Because like, you know, it's an island country. And so there are almost like different ways of advocacy from the different areas. So I'm curious in Hungary, like, you know, amongst the different LGBTQ organizations, what does the hostility look like? I guess there's a history there. And also like, you know, what are, and I think Dr. McGinnis kind of like mentioned this, but like, you know, what are the services being provided based on kind of the struggles of the hostility? Does that make sense? That was a lot there. So hopefully.
Yeah, so most of the organizations started out providing a community organization to people, or like services like information on, for example, how to change gender, like trans people, the legal and health parts, or just organizing events for lesbian women and so on. So hostility, like how it, so a few years ago, Hungary changed the constitution. Now it says that the mother is female, the father is male. So there is no adoption for LGBTQ people. Actually, not even adoption for single people at the moment, with because they want to make sure that LGBTQ people cannot adopt the single people. So you need a special approval from the minister if you're single. And generally there is now the media, like the governmental media, talks all the time about how LGBTQ organizations want to influence your children in school. That, they talk about changing gender, which they don't. And it's totally just buying votes in a way. Like even the government knows it's not true, but I guess it's working to divert attention from other areas that the government doesn't want to talk to. And recently, in the summer, they came out with a so-called pedophile law that says that only state-approved organizations can do any sort of educational program for kids in school. So this is against the LGBTQ organizations, but actually it affects now the organizations that have drug prevention programs as well. Because now they need to be on this list as well. And the list is not out yet. I think deliberately isn't out because now it's just self-censorship, which is the best.
Thank you.
No, it's such an important question. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, Jamie, please. Unless there's anybody else we missed in the Ostrom room. I think we're okay. Let me know. Yeah, Jamie, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll yield the floor if anyone has a pressing question. But no, Krisztina, actually, I was just wondering, how does this work fit into the broader scope of your dissertation? I'd love that kind of context. I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, this is what I'm trying to figure out. So the broader scope of my dissertation, that will involve advocacy organizations as well, for sure. So not just social service organizations, even in service organizations, I will include two more groups, ones working with homeless people and the ones working on women's agenda. So that's contested as well. What I'm working on is like sort of the theoretical framework because I'm focusing on organizational response, but recently there are a few studies that came out on organizational response. So I'm trying to find a new angle. And for this paper, I think this is the angle. I mean, the discussion analysis is not ready yet, as you can see, but I think the angle is sort of okay, like that with the multiple layers of government and the informal pressure, so that in those two factors, Hungary is different. But for the dissertation, I'm trying to figure out how to frame it for the more broader picture, when I'm not just focusing on service organizations.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jamie. And yeah, back to the Ostrom room, please.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I had a question. Sorry if I missed this in the paper. You spent a fair amount of time in the setup talking about formal and informal pressure, and in your analysis, it kind of seems to not really matter that much. I'm curious if there's another dimension that you may cover in regards to like civil society pushback itself. So how does the public push back or support these various issues? Like these three issues in this paper are pretty contested, right? And there's clearly going to be public opinion that's quite divided on them. And we might see beyond demonstrations, we might even see violence as an intimidation tactic. Does that factor into how these organizations are operating?
So you ask how the public views or how the public pushes back on these restrictions, right?
Right. Can they create pressure which is impacting the organizations?
Yes, they can. Yet the public is not creating a lot of pressure. So if the organizations themselves are not organizing the public to create pressure, then there isn't so much pressure. That's kind of the sad reality at the moment. So yes, there have been a few demonstrations, but those were also organized by civil society organizations. They organized a coalition. They gave out press releases and so on. People like that on Facebook. So I'm not saying there is no pressure at all, but it's just the pressure is not enough to change anything. Yes. So I think the government is much more worried about the EU at the moment, how the EU views these restrictions, than about how Hungarian people view the restrictions, because civil society is not the #1 concern of Hungarian people at the moment. I mean, yes, a part of society, I mean, agrees with, and most people, I think, not most, like, let's say half of the people agree that, this is not okay. Yet they don't push back. I guess they don't know how to push back strongly. And half of the people haven't even heard about what the civil society organization is before the government started to talk about them as, evil things in the media. So that's the thing. Some organizations say that it's actually, and there's positive side effects as well. Some organizations that say that they gained a lot of visibility due to the government's propaganda, which gives positive attention as well. It's just not enough to pivot anything.
Thank you. It's very insightful.
Oh, it sure is. We have a few minutes left, everybody. Any other questions, comments, suggestions? Or Krisztina? Yeah, Diego, please. Sorry if I missed you. Yeah.
I was wondering in this last intervention, like how the culture is actually affecting all of these pressures. Like you were saying that there is like half of the population going to something, the other half going to other things. Like, have you seen in your interviews, like the older people is going to want more pressures in those kind of trying to avoid the changes that the non-profits are trying to do, or the youth people is trying to be more, let's say, today culture, like going with the LGBT or the drugs or whatever. Have you seen any kind of patterns in that, in the culture behavior?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you could say that what you said, that older people are more, I guess they believe more in what the government says, that these organizations are foreign funded, even though just a very small percentage of them are foreign funded. So it means they represent foreign interests. They are working against Hungarian values and so on, like, this liberal LGBTQ, gender, whatever, international, globalized thing that is overcoming the national, safe, traditional values. Yes, younger people definitely are much more aligned with what civil society organizations represent. I mean, the liberal part of civil society, because there is a part of civil society organizations, and that is totally fine too. There are religious or that are not created by the government at all. They just happen to promote values that are now promoted by the government. Yet I think I must say what I just said before, that unfortunately what people think is not very important at the moment, because they don't step up either for or against these restrictions so strongly. So the government is much more worried about what if we lose EU membership, because they restrict civil society too much. So that is why they are not enforcing formal pressures at all. It's just like there to scare people, scare organizations, create insecurity and self-censorship. And then they can say that, but actually we're not doing anything. So they are not risking the EU status. Yeah.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this, because I hear what you're saying. It sounds like you're seeing the civil society organizations as something that was introduced into Hungary by the West and by the foreign donors.
I'm not. I hope it's not coming.
Yeah, that's the way it kind of sounded. And I'd encourage you to sort of look at the deeper local roots of these organizations. I mean, if these organizations, I think you mentioned one of them in the immigration area that I think was Organization B, that's almost exclusively based on private donations. Those are private local donations, right? Not foreign donations. Okay, yes. So this must have existed before Hungary got in the EU. And maybe it wasn't that old. I mean, when did it come in place? And in fact, in a sense, it's independent of the civil society as it's portrayed in the anti-civil society media, because it would be a natural outgrowth of Hungarian politics, not an imposition from the outside. Yeah, I think you need a little better sense of what these organizations are, where they came from, and what their identities are, and how they're seen by other organizations. And that's going to be an important effect on the extent to which that organization can or cannot protect itself against government restrictions, or find some space to operate despite not going with the restrictions. I mean, each of these NGOs is in its own ecosystem, its own institutional, social, cultural ecosystem, and each of them have a little different niche than the others, and all of the aspects of those niches affect the kind of behavior that they're going to have and how they're going to differ from the others. And again, look at your interviews. I bet you've got a lot of comments from your interviewees about cultural effects, or how how they're doing something that's intrinsically Hungarian. This has got nothing to do with foreign influence. This is our organization. And yes, we take funding from the West, but we also don't want to do everything they want to talk about. We want to help our fellow Hungarians. And you know, an organization where their CEO's talking like that is going to have a lot more ability to resist government restrictions, I think, than one that is basically a creature of Western donors or the EU or the United Nations. And you need to put a little more flesh on the bones of these NGOs than you provide in here. Again, this was a good start in terms of laying out the cases and the basic sort of variables, but you've got a lot more information in there, and I'm sure your advisors will make you get more of that into your dissertation. But I think,
definitely. The dissertation will talk about everything you just mentioned. It looks on the whole ecosystem. I think maybe I made a mistake with picking these two factors for this paper. I don't know, because now
no, it's not a mistake. It's always useful to get reactions to what you're doing. But I really want to encourage you. There's a lot in there, what you're trying to do, and I know you can't get everything into a paper, any one paper. That's why you do the footnote strategy that Angie was talking about. You're talking about this one, you do this one, you do this one else, and stuff like that. But these are interesting entities.
Yeah.
You know, non-governmental societies operating in a post-communist society with an authoritarian background, and not a real stellar history of democratic tradition, better than some countries, but not stellar. And yet they're surviving and they're doing things, and they're surviving in the context of highly politicized restrictions on this, and make them a little more interesting. I mean, let us know that they're a little more interesting than where they're getting their money.
No, definitely. Yeah.
So it's a good choice, I think, of topic generally for the dissertation. You just need to share some of that excitement that you feel about this topic in the paper. God, it's so easy to tell people what to do once you're retired.
Oh man, look forward to that in the 2050s or thereabout. And Jamie, did you have a quick interjection too before we have to close here?
Yes, I see the Ostrom room also has their hand up, but just quickly.
Oh, do they? Oh,
yes.
Yep.
Yeah, no, Krisztina, just you mentioned Europe, the Europe-Hungarian tension here. Now I'm going back on my previous comment. I suspect you'll need like at least a half a chapter on that as part of the ecosystem of your study. But what's cool about your study is I see very much what we've talked about with the ID framework, that we use it in, like, not that you're using that framework in particular, but the Ostrom ideas can be shaped and should be personalized to the topic at hand as well. And I love seeing that. I can sense that that's happening with your research as well. So that's awesome.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. And thanks, Jamie. Anybody from the Ostrom room, please, before we have to.
This is Bernie.
Bernie, please.
Hi there. So my one, I'm following up a little bit of what Mike said, us retirees, we can make all kinds of wise comments, is when you're studying, like you are, one country and the system in Hungary, you want to show how you're different than other people, other countries sometimes, when in fact, it may be better to show how the similarities are across, let's say, all of Europe or Eastern Europe, and then highlight those things that are different, but where are you the same? And there may be more in common than there is different, and showing that things are in common might be a real strength. And so don't get hung up on just looking for what's different. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Bernie.
Well done all around. Well, Krisztina, any closing thoughts from you?
Well, thank you. That's a lot to think about, and I'm very grateful for it. And yeah, I mean, it's not, this paper, I'm realizing now it's very narrow. It's not how I think about this research, actually. It's just what I put in 90 characters in a very short time. Or 99,000 characters. So yeah, thank you so much. But definitely, I'm aware of the ecosystem that's important. The embeddedness is super important, and it means much more than funding. So yes, that will be discussed. And thank you for reminding me about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, how about one more round of applause for Krisztina? Really, really well done. Yeah, it absolutely is, Angie. This was fantastic. And look forward to seeing you all very soon. Hopefully, even maybe on Friday. Come jam with us. And if not, next week. Thanks again, Krisztina. Great job.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.